Witam wszystkich bardzo serdecznie. Nazywam się Miriam Klimova.
Welcome everyone. My name is Miriam Klimova. I am a rabbi in Haifa in the north of Israel. So today we'll continue discussing the history of the Jewish people, and today's topic is really interesting. It's interesting and relevant. Today we'll be discussing Zionism and Theodor Herzl. But when we talk from the viewpoint of the 21st century and today's awareness, we see some strange juxtapositions. So on the one hand, we say that Jews, for various reasons that we'll discuss today, have arrived to the land of Israel. They started to settle it. So on the one hand, it's the land of their ancestors. On the other hand, it's the land that was inhabited by someone. Today, we are not politicians to talk about politics. But let's say at the very beginning that during the times that we'll be discussing, so the times of Herzl, the idea of a colony, it's not something barbaric. And that's because in those times you had English colonies, British colonies. There was the British Empire, and as they said, the sun never set over the British Empire because it was so enormous.
Że ideą sionizmu w ogóle nie było coś kolonialnego.
Let's also say that the idea of Zionism had nothing to do with colonialism. It was actually the opposite. So the first thing we must say about Zionism, it was the idea to give to a nation that has nothing their own state, their own homeland, the homeland of their ancestors, about which probably most of the people around the world knew because they've opened the Torah, Tanakh, a Bible, or the Quran. There are different names in various religions, but they know that the land that we are discussing was historically a land that had different rulers, but it was a land that historically, over some period of time, was inhabited by the Jewish nation, by the Jewish people. So that's the topic we'll be discussing today. And again, let's turn off our mics.
Więc wracając do naszych tematów, dzisiejszy wykład jest przedłużeniem punktów zwrotnych
Today's
historii.
lecture is a continuation of the
Punkt
topic
zwrotny,
of
który
turning
mówi nam
points in
o tym,
history.
że naród żydowski osiedla się w ziemi Izraela,
So the turning point that says
jest
that the
bardzo
Jewish
ważny.
people are settling
Jesteśmy
in the land
na
of
razie
Israel.
w wieku XIX.
So as
Jesteśmy
of now,
w
we
szeregu
are in the
historycznych
19th
zdarzeń,
century,
które prowadzą nas do idei
and we are in the
państwa.
middle of
Jakie to były
some
wydarzenia?
historical
Już o tym
events that
mówiliśmy.
have led
To jest
us to the
emancypacja.
idea
To
of a
jest
state.
prawo
We've already
człowieka,
discussed some of
które
them.
każdy
That was
obywatel nabywa.
emancipation,
Tak?
the
To
rights,
jest
the
to,
human rights
że
that
każdy
every
człowiek
citizen
staje się
is
obywatelem,
entitled to,
już nie jest
the idea
zobowiązany
that
do
every
jakichś
person
ograniczeń z jednej
becomes a
strony, z drugiej
citizen,
strony jest
that
zobowiązany do
they
bycia
no longer
obywatelem
face
swojego
any
państwa, więc
restrictions,
też
but on
ma
the other hand,
obraniać
they
to państwo,
should
też
make the
ma
commitment
odczuwać
to be the
siebie, że
citizen of a
jest
state. So
jednostką,
they
która
should
przynależy do
defend the
tego
state,
państwa.
they should
I
view
wszystko
themselves
było
as an
bardzo
individual
miło,
who
tak?
is
Kiedy
part of that
mówiliśmy o
state.
emancypacji, kiedy
So it
mówiliśmy o
all seemed
powstaniu
very
nowych
nice.
ruchów,
When we talked
chcieliśmy
about
odczuwać siebie,
emancipation, the
na
establishment
przykład,
of new
jeżeli mieszkaliśmy w
movements,
Niemcach, Niemcami, którzy
for
są
example, if
religii
we
żydowskiej. Chcieliśmy
were
odczuwać
living in
siebie
Germany, we
Polakami,
wanted to view
którzy są w
ourselves as
religii żydowskiej.
Germans, in Poland
Ale czy
as
tak
Poles,
postrzegano
so
nas,
German or Poles
to już
of
jest
the
zupełnie
Jewish
inny temat,
religion.
tak?
But were we actually
Pomimo
perceived that
wszystkiego,
way?
co
That's
się
actually a
zdarzyło
different topic.
w Europie w tych czasach, pomimo tego, że
So in spite of everything that happened in Europe in those times, and even though we might have thought that we are parts of a community, that we've seen various events such as the Spring of Nations or revolutions, nonetheless, in the midst of all that, we are still facing challenges. So, for example, it was the end of an autonomous community. We are no longer a state within a state. So, how should we act now? We cannot tell everyone, okay, you can study at the university, but you must be still part of a Jewish community. And also the issue of integrating with the rest of the society. So as we said, that the price for emancipation, namely integration, might be a threat for the continued existence of Jewishness. And that's why Jewish leaders were warning people. They were alarmed because many members would be leaving the Jewish community. And they had a couple of answers to this, solutions. One of them was Reform Judaism. It gave people the opportunity to be part of two worlds. On the one hand, to still be a Jew, and on the other part, to be part and integrate with the broader society. But another option or reply was orthodoxy. They would say, we don't want to be part of the society. We want for everything to remain exactly the way it is now. Anything that's new is forbidden. We don't want anything new. That's how we'll be fighting with assimilation. And did this provide us a solution so that we could live peacefully? No. Expressions of anti-Semitism not only failed to diminish, but they actually intensified. The hope for a new Europe failed to materialize. It was no longer there. The enlightenment that would accept Jews the way they were was not there, and xenophobic moods did not disappear, but simply this hatred towards Jews or antipathy towards Jews has changed its form. So first, they were hating Jews due to their religious situation, and now it would change into racial anti-Semitism. So before it was a religious dispute, whereas now you have people asking about your origins, about your blood. So how can we look at it? What was bothering so much in the European community? Even the Jews who spoke German or French, who felt that they were part of the German, French, or European society, that they were part of the Enlightenment. On the one hand, they were part of the society, but on the other hand, they still had this tendency to stay closer to other Jews. For example, when it comes to marriage, they would tend to marry within their own society. So yes, we are integrated, but well, I'll take for my wife a Mrs. Goldberg, not Miss Kowalska or Smith. So that for non-Jews was proof that Jews are actually a separate caste, that they are unwilling or unable to be integrated. Thus, various social frameworks, such as the popular secular Freemasons, continue to exclude Jews because they are still the other. They may have rights now, but they are still the other.
Nie chcemy, ponieważ oni są inni. Nadal mają prawa,
So
ale
that's
są
how Jews
inni.
were still
I
viewed. And in this
zwracając na to
context,
uwagę,
in
że
1862, we
właśnie
have
w
a
ten
German
sposób
Jew, a
odbierano
socialist, Moses
nadal Żydów.
Hess.
Spotykamy tutaj w
In almost every town in
1862
Israel,
roku
there is a
niemieckiego
street
Żyda,
named after
socjalistę,
him.
Moses Hess, Moshe Hess. Prawie w każdym mieście w Izraelu jest ulica nazwana jego imieniem, który
So he offered a
wystąpił z
solution out of this
koncepcją,
situation,
żeby
namely
Żydzi
by establishing a Jewish state
mogli
in
wyjść z tej
Palestine,
sytuacji przez jedyny sposób, jak
Eretz
przez to,
Israel.
że będzie założone państwo
That was the name.
żydowskie w Palestynie.
So he published the book
Eretz
Rome and
Israel, taką
Jerusalem.
nazwę
And he
nosiła w
said in
tych
there
czasach.
that
I
anti-Semitism is
mówi nam,
eternal, that you
publikując
simply
właśnie
cannot
tak,
fight it off.
Rzym i
And as a
Jerozolimę,
socialist, he said, we
argumentuje, że
need our
antysemityzm
own
jest
state.
wieczny, że nie da się jego zwalczyć. Jak socjalista mówi, potrzebujemy państwa, własnego państwa.
So when it comes to the Jewish
I mówi
problem,
nam
namely that Jews
o
are
tym,
not welcomed in
że tą
European
kwestią
societies,
żydowską,
he
czyli
said that
pytanie
this problem cannot be
nieprzyjmowania
solved.
Żydów
It is
w
not
każdym
something related
społeczeństwie
to
europejskim
religion, because everyone is still viewing it as a
nie da się
religious problem.
rozwiązać.
But
Tak?
he said,
Mówi nam, że
no,
to nie jest
we are
problem
a
związany z
nation, a
religią,
people.
bo nadal wszyscy odbierają jego jako problem religijny. Mówi
So
nie. Jesteśmy nacją, narodem. I ten problem
if we
nie
want to
może być
solve this problem, we
rozwiązany
need to solve it
środkami politycznymi.
politically. So we need to have our
Musimy
own
mieć
state.
własne państwo. Czy ta książka, którą
How was this
napisał,
book received?
była
Was it a
przyznana?
popular idea
Czy
among Jews?
Żydzi powiedzieli,
No.
a tak,
Most
okej,
of them
to
simply
jest super
ignored
idea?
it. They
Nie. W dużej
didn't want
mierze
to
po
hear
prostu
about it. They would say, well,
zignorowali ją.
we live in good
Nie chcemy tego
times, everything
słyszeć.
will be well,
Nie,
we are
jesteśmy
integrating,
w
there's been
czasach dobrych.
emancipation, we have
Wszystko będzie
rights
dobrze.
now.
Integrujemy się,
We
jesteśmy
want to
częścią
stay
społeczeństwa,
here.
emancypacja, mamy prawa.
So they didn't want to accept
Pobudujemy
it.
siebie tutaj.
And another
Nie chcieli
example,
przyjąć to. I jakie
in
jeszcze
the same
przykłady
year,
byli?
so
W tym samym
1862,
roku,
an Orthodox rabbi,
1862,
Hirsch Kalischer, a Polish rabbi,
ortodoksyjny rabin,
published in Hebrew
Hirsch
a
Kalischer,
pamphlet.
polski rabin, publikuje
He
po
called it
hebrajsku
Dreyfus
broszurę,
Zion.
którą
It's a very interesting name
nazwał Dreyfus
because the
Zion.
verb drosh,
Tak?
the Hebrew verb,
Dreyfus
has
Zion, w ogóle to jest
many
bardzo
different
ciekawa
meanings.
nazwa,
For
ponieważ
example,
droszyk
drasha
czasownik
is the
hebrajski
sermon of the rabbi.
ma wiele znaczeń. Na przykład drasza
So
to jest
drosh
właśnie
is to
kazanie
think about something,
rabina.
to
Czyli
interpret
drosz to
something,
jest
to
coś
explain something. But
myśleć
drosh
o czymś
is also
i
to
interpretować
expect
coś, tak?
something or to
Wyjaśniać coś.
search for
Ale
something,
drosz to też jest wymagać coś,
because
czyli
expecting
drosz
something and searching
to
for
jest też
something is
szukać
related,
coś,
because it
ponieważ
means we want
wymaganie i
something.
szukanie jest
So we
powiązane
could
z
translate the
intencją tego, że
title as
chcemy czegoś.
Searching
Tak?
for
Więc
Zion.
możemy przetłumaczyć tą broszurę jako szukając Syjonu i argumentuje właśnie w tej broszurze, że Żydzi powinni
And in
zacząć
this pamphlet,
budować
he
własne
says that the
narodowe
Jews should
państwo.
start
Muszą
building their
emigrować
own
do
national
Palestyny.
states, that they
Muszą
should
żyć na Ziemi
emigrate to
Świętej,
Palestine, that they
powinni tam
must live
mieszkać
in
i
the
czekać
Holy
na
Land
Mesjasza.
and
To był
wait
Żydem
there for the
ortodoksyjnym.
Messiah.
I mówił to z
He was an
punktu widzenia
Orthodox Jew, so he
mesjańskiego,
talked about
że
it from a
każdy Żyd
messianic point of
powinien
view, that
mieszkać
every
na
Jew
Ziemi
should
Świętej.
live in the Holy Land.
Ale jeżeli zapytacie, czy ta praca była przyjęta,
So how was this
bardzo
text
podobnie do
received?
Hessa,
Well,
nie.
just as with Hess, it was
Nie
not
wywołała
popular.
jakiś wielki Nic. Prawie nic.
This work
Chociaż
too
jeżeli
made
patrzymy
barely a
globalnie z
ripple in
punktu
its
widzenia
time.
naszego, z XXI wieku, to
But if
wiemy
we
i
look at it
widzimy,
from our viewpoint, from the
że
21st century,
możemy nazwać
then
ich
we can say that we can call them
pierwszymi
proto-Zionists.
ludźmi,
So
którzy
the
zaczęli
first
mówić,
people
tak, czy
who
z punktu widzenia
were floating
socjalizmu,
this
jak Hess,
idea, whether
czy z
from a
punktu
socialist point
widzenia
of view like
religii,
Hess or from a religious point of
jak
view like
Kalischer,
Kalischer.
ale właśnie tymi ludźmi,
These
którzy
were the
głosili
people
idee
who were
sionistyczne jeszcze
proposing
zanim
Zionist ideas
narodziło się
even
słowo
before the word
sionizm.
Zionism
Tak.
appeared.
Co się dzieje tymczasem trochę wschodniej, to też wiemy.
And what was happening
Na razie byliśmy
more to
na
the east
zachodzie
in those
Europy.
times?
Wschodniej
Before we were in
części
West
wiemy,
Europe,
że idee emancypacji nigdy tam nie trafiły.
we know that
Nigdy
the
nie były
idea of
tam przyjęte.
emancipation never reached the
Wiemy,
east
że
of Europe. They were not accepted
1881
there.
rok zapamiętał
And as
się
we
w
know,
historii
in
żydowskiej
1881,
jako masowa
there was
imigracja
a mass
przez liczne
migration, and
pogromy,
that was due
przez
to numerous
zabójstwa,
pogroms, many
gwałcenia,
killings, many rapes.
imigrują do Stanów Zjednoczonych,
So Jews
imigrują do
migrated to the
Europy
United States
Zachodniej, do
and
różnych
to
państw.
Western Europe,
I
to various
właśnie pod
countries.
wpływem tej rosnącej w Europie świadomości
So,
nacjonalistycznej w
due to the
niektórych
growing
wąskich
nationalist
kręgach
awareness
żydowskich
or
w Rosji
consciousness in Europe,
zatrwają te
some
pogromy,
small Jewish circles in
zaczęto
Russia where
dyskutować,
you had the
planować,
pogroms, they
wspierać
would begin to
emigrację
discuss, plan and support
właśnie do ziemi
emigration
Izraela,
to the land
jako
of Israel.
miejsca docelowego, preferowanego, tak?
They viewed it as their
I
preferred destination.
nie patrząc na to, że liczni Żydzi wyjechali do Stanów Zjednoczonych, czym mówiliśmy w
As we
poprzednim
discussed
rozdziale, tak?
in the
Emigracja
previous
ta
chapter, many Jews
doszła do miliona.
migrated to the United
W tych
States.
czasach to
It
jest
was
bardzo,
even up to
bardzo
1 million, so
wielki
that was a
procent
really
narodu
large
żydowskiego.
percent of the Jewish
I też
nation.
odczuwamy to w dniu
And we
dzisiejszym.
also
Tak?
experience that today.
Diaspora w Stanach Zjednoczonych jest
The
prawie
Jewish
tak samo
diaspora in
liczna
the
jak
United States
ilość
is
Żydów, którzy
almost as
mieszkają w ziemi
numerous as
Izraela.
the population
Więc
of Jews
w
in the land
końcu
of Israel.
Żydzi rosyjscy, którzy właśnie byli częścią tej wielkiej
So
migracji,
Russian Jews who are part of this mass
doszli
migration
też częściowo do
also
idei imigracji
partially
do
came up with this
Syjonu.
idea to
Jak
emigrate to
ta
Zion.
grupa, która się zorganizowała wokół tej idei, mogła
And
się nazwać?
there was a group formed
Miłośnicy
around this idea,
Syjonu,
and
Hovevei
their name
Zion.
was Hovevei Zion,
W różnych
lovers of
krajach
Zion.
Europy Wschodniej powstają grupy Hovevei Zion,
So you
którzy
had several
zachęcają do
such Hovevei
emigracji do
Zion
ziemi
groups, and they
Izraela.
were encouraging the
Jesteśmy właśnie
migration to
na
the land of
początku
Israel.
lat
This
80.,
is the
czyli
beginning of the 1880s.
1881,
It's 1881,
1882.
1882.
I mówimy o działalności tej organizacji, którą wspierają kilka
So we
kluczowych
have this
osób.
organization and we have
Takich jak na
some
przykład Moshe
key
Leib
figures
William Bloom.
related to it, like Moshe
Kim
Leib
był ten
William
człowiek?
Bloom.
Wybitnym człowiekiem. Zasymilowany
He was a
rosyjski Żyd.
prominent person, an assimilated
Przywódca
Russian Jew. He
ruchu
was the head
intelektualnego
of the
Haskali
intellectual
w
movement of
Rosji.
Haskalah in
Ale po
Russia.
wybuchu pogromów zdaje sobie radę, że
But after the
asymilacja
pogroms,
w ogóle
he
nie jest
realized that
odpowiedzią na
assimilation
wojnę.
is not
Tak?
a helpful
I raptem
solution.
zmienia
So
kierunek.
suddenly he
Z jednej
changed his
strony
mind.
chciał na własnym przykładzie
On the
myślał
one
sobie,
hand, based on
jestem
his
już
own
częścią
example, he was
integrowaną
thinking, well, I'm
społeczeństwa, to
already an
teraz mi się nic nie
integrated part of
stanie.
the society,
I
so
raptem
I'm
odczuwa te
safe.
wszystkie pogromy na
And
siebie,
then
na sobie.
suddenly he
Tak?
experienced
To
all the
jest ciekawy
pogroms. So
zwrotny
that
punkt
was also
kolejny.
another interesting
Nawet
turning
nie w
point,
historii
even not
żydowskiej, w
within the
historii
Jewish history,
ludzkiej,
but in a human history,
człowieka.
in the history of a
Wszystkie
person.
zmiany historyczne, które następują, zawdzięczają
all the
pędu,
historical
co ten
changes
człowiek
that
odkrył w
happen are
swoim życiu.
related to what
I
people experience in their life.
najbardziej, myślę, silne zmiany to przychodzą nie z
And
radości.
I
Nie.
believe that
Odczuwają
the most
właśnie
significant changes
te
are
pogromy, które
not
stają
caused
się
by someone's happy
siłą
experiences, but
popędzającą.
if we have
I wtedy
some
Moshe Leib myśli,
difficult
nie,
experiences that become the driving
asymilacja
force.
nic nie
So
minęła.
Moshe Leib said, no,
Musi to być inna
assimilation
idea.
is not
Musi to
helping us.
być
We need a
idea,
different
która
idea.
pomoże nam,
We
z tym,
need
że
an
Żydzi są
idea that will
prześladowani we
help
wszystkich
us,
państwach. I
since the
doszedł do
Jews
wniosku,
are
że jedynym
persecuted in
sposobem rozwiązania
all
tej
the
kwestii
states. So
żydowskiej
he
jest
decided that
właśnie
the only
utworzenie
solution is
państwa
the
żydowskiego.
establishment of a Jewish
Drugą
state.
ważną osobistością był
Another
Leon
important
Pinsker,
figure was
który
Leon
był
Pinsker.
zasymilowanym
He was
Żydem
also an
rosyjskim,
assimilated Russian Jew.
który służył wojskowym
He was
lekarzem,
a
nawet
military
miał
doctor.
medal
He
przez to,
even
że w
received a
armii
medal
rosyjskiej był w
because
wojnie
he
krymskiej
was part of the
i
Russian army
również
during
pogromy
the Crimea
żydowskie
War. And
zmieniły
also
jego
in his
podejście
case, the pogroms
do
changed
możliwości
his view
asymilacji.
when it
Powiedział,
comes
nie,
to
tej asymilacji
assimilation. He
nigdy nie
said,
będzie.
no, there will
Nigdy nie
never be
będziemy
assimilation.
wszyscy.
We will never be like
Zawsze
everyone
będą
else.
postrzegać
They
nas
will
inaczej.
always view us
I
as
tę ideę
the
poparł też
different
rabin
ones.
Samuel, który po prostu był ortodoksyjnym
Rabbi
rabinem
Samuel
i
was an
zaczął
Orthodox
zachęcać
rabbi,
wszystkich do powrotu do
and he
Syjonu,
would
do
encourage
miłości do
everyone
Syjonu.
to go
Powiedział, że
back to
trzeba
Zion, to
propagować tą
love
ideę,
Zion,
trzeba tam
that you have to
jechać.
promote this idea, that you
I
have to go there.
właśnie w Katowicach w listopadzie
So in Katowice in November
1884
of
roku odbyła się
1884,
konferencja
there was a
Hovevei Zion.
conference of the Hovevei Zion
Pierwsza z
group,
takich
the
konferencji,
first of such
kiedy
conferences.
mówimy o tym, co się stało dalej
So
z
as we
ideami,
discuss what
to
happened
wiemy,
next with
że
these
pierwsze grupy
ideas, then we know that the
Hovevei
first group of
emigrują z Rosji
Hovevei
z
Zion were
Rumunii i
migrating from Russia,
zakładają
from Romania,
swoje
and they were
miasta i
establishing
będą
their
się nazywały
towns.
z
So
czasem
with
Aliyah
time, they would
Rishona,
be
czyli
called
pierwsza Aliyah,
Aliyah
pierwsze
Rishona, so the
wchodzenie do
first
ziemi
Aliyah, the
Izraela.
first ascending to the
Kiedy
land of
mówimy
Israel.
o geograficznych
So
terenach,
in
to wiemy,
terms
że
of
w
geography, we know that
1882
in
roku grupa
1882,
takich
a
Hovevei
group of
Zionów,
Hovevei
14
Zion,
studentów
14
opuściła miasto
students, they
Charków,
left Kharkiv.
Charków, które do dnia dzisiejszego jest
So
pełne
even
Żydów,
today you have many Jews in
i
Kharkiv.
popłynęli
So
do
they sailed
Palestyny,
to
osiedlili się
Palestine, they
wzdłuż
settled
wybrzeża,
along the coast,
zakładają
and they
społeczność
established a
rolniczą
farming
i
community,
nazywają ją
which they
Rishon
called Rishon
LeZion.
LeZion.
Dzisiaj mamy to miasto,
And we still
Rishon
have this
LeZion.
town,
Jeżeli
Rishon
przetłumaczymy
LeZion,
nazwę miasta, to
and that
będzie
name
pierwszy w
means
Syjonie.
the first in
I
Zion.
w ciągu następnych 20 lat kolejne grupy
Over the next
osadników
20 years,
zakładają
successive
szereg
groups of
różnych
settlers would
miast i
establish
gospodarek.
various
Tak
towns,
więc
various communities.
widzimy, że imigracja do ziemi Izraela już
So
wisi
the
w powietrzu.
migration
Na
to the
razie
land of
jest
Israel was already felt in the
nie,
air.
na razie
It was
stopniowo,
happening
nie
gradually.
stopniowo, ale zrozumiało, że to jest właśnie rozwiązanie problemu,
It was
który wisi
understood that
nad
this is
żydostwem
the
europejskim.
solution to the Jewish
W tej
problem,
chwili
the
tutaj
problem
właśnie
of European
przechodzimy do
Jews.
postaci Theodora Herzla.
And here we
Był
move to
ambitnym,
Theodor
młodym
Herzl. He
pisarzem,
was an ambitious
który
young
pochodził z
writer, and he
zintegrowanej
came from an
żydowskiej rodziny.
integrated
Nawet
Jewish
jeżeli będziemy
family.
czytać o nim w języku hebrajskim, to często mówi się o nim, że z
Even if we
asymilowanej
read
rodziny.
about
Nie jest
him
to
in
prawda.
Hebrew, they
Nie
say
był
he came
z
from an
asymilowanej
assimilated
rodziny.
family, but that is
Rodzina
not
ta
true.
była żydowska, która
It
miała
was a
tradycję
Jewish
żydowską w
family
swoim
who
domu,
maintained
ale
the
była
Jewish
rodziną
tradition in their
współczesną,
home, but it
tak?
was a modern
Z
family.
Budapesztu, którzy
They
chodzili
lived
do
in
nowych
Budapest. They
synagog,
would
do
go to
tych
the
pięknych,
new
do których
synagogues,
można przyjechać, tak?
to
Nie
the
były to
beautiful
synagogi
ones.
ortodoksyjne, nie, były
They
to
were
nowe
not
nurty. Nurt,
Orthodox
z którego
synagogues.
pochodziła
They
jego
were the
rodzina, nie
new
zachował się
movements. That movement was very close to conservative Judaism. Herzl himself underwent ceremonies that were reform ceremonies, for example, confirmation, that was accepted in the reform movement back then in the 19th century.
Dlaczego mówimy oni? Ponieważ zaczynamy z punktu, że był dziennikarzem.
So Herzl was a journalist, and he was appointed the Paris correspondent for the liberal Austrian newspaper Neue Freie Presse. And over the next several years, starting from 1891, he could see what is happening in the French society. So he saw more and more the tension between the dream of emancipation and the reality. And that's because in reality, he saw not the development of emancipation and equal rights, but actually there was a rising antisemitism.
Ważnym w jego spojrzeniach i punktem ważnym w historii.
An important point that shaped Herzl's views, an important point in history that showed Jews whether they can or cannot be part of society was the Dreyfus trial. The trial took place between 1894 and 1895. Alfred Dreyfus was a minor Jewish officer in the French army. Why is his name so well known? Because he was accused of passing war secrets to the Germans. Were there any evidence? Well, the evidence was thin, but nonetheless he was convicted and sentenced to exile on Devil's Island. So the trial was secret, it was a military investigation, but still enough information was revealed. And that's why you had protests of liberal politicians and journalists. And here one of the prominent figures, I read texts of this author at school. He would study this during Polish language classes. So it was 1898. The novelist Emile Zola published an open letter to the government. And it started with the famous words that we see here in front of us, j'accuse. And he was accusing the army and the government. He said that Dreyfus was actually convicted because of corruption, incompetence, and anti-Semitism. So he said that he was accused not because there was evidence against him, no, but just because he was Jewish. So the trial lasted for several years. We know that Zola also had to flee the country, that well, he had many difficulties, so it's not always easy to tell the truth. But after many years, in 1906, Dreyfus was exonerated. So it took more than 10 years. Ultimately, the sloppiness and overt dishonesty of the prosecution were revealed. But it took time, and this also became a turning point. Because here it was not just about religious views. It's not that the church had something against Jews living there, but here we see that in the context of modernization, even in the context of emancipation, nonetheless, they are paying attention. They are saying that someone is different.
Przed procesem Herzl formułuje swoją analizę
Even
sytuacji
before
Żydów
the trial, Herzl published
i
his
wszystko to robi
analysis
w
of the
broszurze,
situation of the
którą
Jews,
nazywa Der Judenstaat,
and he published it in
państwo
a brochure and a
żydowskie,
pamphlet,
którą
Der
publikuje w
Judenstaat, the Jewish State. He
1896
published
roku.
it in 1896.
Jego główne twierdzenie było echem tego, co Hess już
And
powiedział.
his main
Tak?
statements
Już
resembled
przedstawił
those of
to
Hess.
Moshe Hess 3 dekady
So, of
wcześniej.
what Hess
Co?
already
Że nadzieja na
described 3 decades
emancypację to jest iluzja.
before, that
Mówi nam teraz o tym
basically
Herzl.
emancipation is an illusion. And now
Mówi nam, że
Herzl
Żydzi
is
są
saying the
narodem.
same thing.
Nie
He
można ich
said that
zasymilować z
Jews are
innymi
a
narodami
nation, so
Europy,
they cannot be assimilated with other
ponieważ
nations
są
of
narodem.
Europe
Nie są to
because they are a
jedynie
nation.
Niemcy,
They are
którzy
not
wyznają
simply
religię
Jews
żydowską.
of
Nie.
the
Mówi
they
nam
are not simply
otwarcie,
Germans
że
of the Jewish
Żydzi
religion.
są i
No,
religią, i
he's saying
narodem
that Jews are both a
razem,
religion and a
jednocześnie. Nie
nationality
da się to
together.
rozłączyć.
And
Tak?
you cannot separate those
I
two
mówi
aspects.
nam, że rozwiązaniem tego problemu musi być
So he says
przeniesienie
that the
Żydów z
solution
Europy do ich
of this
własnego
problem
miejsca.
must be to move the
Ale
Jews from
uwaga na
Europe to a
razie, do
place of their
własnego
own.
miejsca.
But let's emphasize that here
Co
he
nam
said
mówi?
a
Czy
place of
ktoś
their
jest
own.
gotowy nam pomóc i
So what
przeczytać?
does it
To
mean
właśnie jest
actually?
cytat z tego
Here we have a
Judenstatu.
quote from
Kogo
Judenstaat,
mogę
from
prosić?
the text.
Mogę przeczytać.
Dziękuję Basiu.
Kwestia żydowska wciąż istnieje.
The Jewish
Głupotą
question
byłoby temu
still
zaprzeczać.
exists. It
Jest
would
to
be foolish to
pozostałość
deny it.
średniowiecza, z której
It is a
cywilizowane
remnant of the
narody nie
Middle
są jeszcze
Ages,
w
which
stanie się
civilized nations
otrząsnąć,
do not
mimo że
even yet
próbują.
seem able to
Z
shake
pewnością
off,
okazują
try as they
szczere
will.
pragnienie, by to
They
zrobić,
certainly
kiedy
showed
dały
a
nam
generous desire to do
emancypację.
so when they
Kwestie
emancipated
żydowskie
us.
istnieją
The Jewish
wszędzie,
question
gdzie Żydzi
exists
żyją w
wherever
zauważalnej
Jews
liczbie.
live in
Tam,
perceptible
gdzie jej nie ma,
numbers. Where
Żydzi
it does
sami
not
ją
exist,
przynoszą
it is
migrując.
carried by
W
Jews in the
naturalny
course of
sposób
their
przenosimy
migrations.
się do miejsc, gdzie nie
We
jesteśmy
naturally move to
prześladowani,
those
a tam nasz
places where we
obecność
are not
wywołuje prześladowania.
persecuted, and there
Tak jest w
our
każdym
presence
kraju i tak
produces
pozostanie,
persecution.
nawet
This
w
is
tych
the case in
wysoce
every country
cywilizowanych,
and
na
will
przykład we
remain so,
Francji.
even in those
Dopóki
highly
kwestia
civilized,
żydowska nie
for
znajdzie
instance, France,
rozwiązania na
until the
gruncie
Jewish
politycznym,
question finds a solution
nieszczęśni
on a
Żydzi przenoszą
political basis. The
teraz nasionę
unfortunate Jews are
antysemityzmu
now
do
carrying
Anglii.
the seeds of
Przywieźli je już
anti-Semitism
do
into
Ameryki.
England. They have already introduced it into America.
Że posłuchajcie, im bardziej Żydzi się
So he's
poprawiają,
saying, well, listen,
starają się
the
być
more
częścią
Jews try, the more they
społeczeństwa,
try to improve,
tym
to
bardziej
become
ich
part of the
nienawidzą.
society, the
Tak?
more
Gdzie
they
by
are
nie poszli,
hated.
to nigdy
Wherever
nie
they
będą w
go, they
stanie
will never
zintegrować
be
się z
able
innymi
to
narodami.
integrate with other
Mówi nam,
nations.
uważam, że rozumiem
He
antysemityzm,
said,
który jest
I
naprawdę
believe that I
bardzo
understand
złożonym ruchem.
anti-Semitism,
Patrzą na
which is
jakiegoś
really a
żydowskiego
highly
punktu widzenia,
complex
ale
movement.
bez strachu
I
czy
consider it
nienawiści.
from a Jewish
Uważam, że
standpoint,
dostrzegam
yet
obecne
without
w
fear
nim
or
elementy
hatred.
tak,
I believe that I can see
wulgarnego
what
sportu.
elements there are in it of a
I
vulgar
raz za
sport.
razem po prostu
So
mówi
he
nam, że
keeps on
kwestia
repeating
żydowska ma
that the
charakter narodowy.
Jewish
Musi być rozwiązana dlatego w
problem
sposób
is a
solidariczny
national
pomiędzy
matter, and
narodami, a
that's
nie przez
why
ulicę, nie przez
it
społeczność.
should be
I
resolved on a political level.
mówi nam, jesteśmy narodem,
He's
nie
saying
religią,
we are a
jednym
nation,
narodem.
not just a religion,
Czyli
we are one
emancypacja
nation.
według Herzla jest skazana na porażkę.
So, in
Dopóki
Herzl's
Żydzi są
view,
mniejszością
emancipation
ze
will
względu
never
na to,
succeed as
tak,
long as Jews
nawet, że dobrze
are
się
a minority.
zachowują czy nie,
Doesn't matter
będą
if they are
uważani za
behaving
obcych, bo
appropriately or
są
not, they will
mniejszością.
be always
Ich
viewed as
pozycja
the
zawsze
other
będzie
because
słaba.
they are the minority.
I w
So
kręgach
they
społecznych,
will
w
never
których on
be
dorastał,
strong.
Herzl, gdzie była ta wizja społeczeństwa
So
oświeconego,
the ideas that Herzl
pokój ten nie był
heard
przyjęty.
about when he was growing up, so
I
emancipation for
kręgach, w których
everyone,
dorastał,
this was something contrary to what he's saying now. So they would say, yes, we want to become part of the broader society. So his ideas, Herzl's ideas, were not immediately accepted and approved. At that time, he's not talking about Eretz Israel or Palestine. At this point, it was important for him that Jews have their own land. He's saying that we have tried to become part of the society, but we were never allowed to do it. In countries where we have lived for centuries, we are still cried down as strangers. So it doesn't matter where we live, there is no country where Jews would not be suffering. So he's saying that the goal is the establishment of a state. And this is very important. At the beginning, Herzl was not saying that the goal is a state in a specific geographical location. But he said, but I think we shall not be left in peace, no matter what we do. We may be patriots in the states we live in, we can defend them, we can be loyal patriots like Dreyfus, but he said, we will not be left in peace. So he said, let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. Doesn't matter where. The rest we shall manage for ourselves. And one more quote from the same text. The creation of a new state is neither ridiculous nor impossible. We have in our day witnessed the process in connection with nations which were not largely members of the middle class, but poorer, less educated, and consequently weaker than ourselves. The governments of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism will be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want. So Herzl assumes that the nations of the world will be only too happy to help so as to get rid of their Jews. Was that so? As we know, that wasn't the case.
Idea państwa swego nie pochodzi od Herzla, ale nigdy nie zyskała przed nim tak wielkiego
So this idea that Jews should have their own state was never so emphasized as in Herzl's texts, even though it did appear before, but it was never something that authors would focus on until Herzl started to talk about it, and he changed the history of Jews and of the world. So his text was not a bestseller. No one really wanted to support him, but nonetheless, with time, retroactively, with hindsight, this text was viewed as a fundamental text of the Zionist movement.
Nie było tam określonego ani kluczowych elementów emigracji.
He did not describe in detail elements such as migration and how to get ready for it, but he offered a certain vision, and this vision would become more and more popular to migrate and to create your own state.
Większości czytelników, nawet ci sionistyczni aktywisty w Rosji, postrzegali jego manifest jako
even
jakiegoś wariata.
activists in Russia would
nie chciał tak za
view
bardzo jego czytać.
Herzl as
Nie było za
someone,
dużo
let's
entuzjastów,
say,
może
crazy.
głównie studenci.
No,
Jak zawsze w
not
każdej
a lot of
rewolucji
people
czy
would
nowej idei, to zawsze studenci
accept
są
his
pierwszymi,
ideas.
żeby
Well, maybe
wesprzeć to.
besides some
I
students,
jednak od
students are
chwili
always the first to
publikacji
accept some
zmienia się.
ideas, but
Zaczęliśmy z tego
after some
wynika, że
time,
teraz
it changed.
od tej chwili staje się
So
aktywistą.
before Herzl was a journalist, and now he became an
Pozostałe
activist.
8 lat swego życia, jedynie 8, ponieważ już
For the remaining 8 years of his life,
zmarł.
only 8 years because he
Biegł
died
bardzo
in
młodym,
1904 at the
44
early age of
lat.
44.
Poświęcił całe swoje życie, cały swój czas.
So he
całą swoją
devoted
energię
all of
i
his
wszystkie swoje
all of his
kości,
time,
wszystko,
all
co
of his
miał,
energy,
cały
all of
swój
his
odziedziczony
inheritance,
spadek. A jego
because his
ojciec
father had been a
był
successful
kupcem,
merchant.
który odnosił sukcesy, więc spadek ten był
So the
ogromny.
inheritance was
Wszystko
enormous.
to poświęcił
So Herzl dedicated
na
all
budownictwo
that
państwa
to build
przyszłego
the future
Izraela.
state of Israel.
Mówimy o tym, ile to pieniędzy nawet jego własnych, to Herzl stracił
So
w ten
as for
sposób
the exact
80
amount, then
000
Herzl
marek.
had burned through
Nic to nam
80,000
nie
marks.
mówi w dniu
Of course, we have no
ale
idea
powiemy, że
of
to mniej
what the
więcej
value is
9
today,
milionów
but
dolarów,
it's at least $9
możemy
million
sobie wyobrazić.
in today's value.
Kiedy zmarł, nie miał nic.
So when Herzl
Wszystko
died,
to.
he was
Wyobraźcie sobie, że
penniless.
człowiek był milionerem. 9
So he was a
milionów
millionaire. He had
mniej więcej.
about $9 million,
Wszystko to poświęca
and he devoted
swoje
all
życie.
that to promote his idea.
Kiedy zmarł, nawet zwolennicy jego
So when
musieli
he
zrobić
died,
zbiór
his
się, tak żeby
supporters actually had to take up a collection
zapewnić
to
jego
provide for
dzieciom
his children's
wykształcenie.
education.
Czyli nawet o swoich dzieciach nie pomyślał tak, jak pomyślał
So
o państwie Izrael.
rather than securing his children's future,
Dzięki
he would
tym
rather
funduszom
focus on his
założył
idea of the
sionisticką
Jewish state.
gazetę Die Welt, Świat.
With those funds,
W
he founded a
latach
Zionist newspaper, Die Welt, the World.
1897 i 1903 zwołał
Between
6
1897 and
kongresów
1903, he
sionistycznych,
convened 6 Zionist congresses.
które właśnie zmienili ideologię i zmienili ideę
And
jego
these congresses
państwa,
changed
tak?
the
Jeździł
ideology,
od
the
stolicy do stolicy
idea that we
wygodnie,
need
od
a
milionera
state.
do
So
milionera,
he
szukał
would
wsparcia
travel through
dyplomatów,
Europe.
szukał wsparcia finansowego
He shuttled
dla
from
tego
capital to
swojego
capital and from
planu.
millionaire to millionaire, seeking diplomatic and financial
I
support
nawet
for his plan.
ciekawy cytat z jego dziennika. Powiedział po pierwszym
So
kongresie
after the first
1897
Congress
powiedział, gdybym miał
in
podsumować ten
1897, he
kongres,
said, if I were to
jednym
sum
słowem,
up the Congress with one word,
byłby one następujące.
I would say,
Założyłem państwo
I have
żydowskie.
established the Jewish state
Czyli jest jeszcze
during the
w
Congress.
1997 roku.
So it's
Ale już
1897, but
wie,
he already
odczuwa do
knows, he
przodu,
can
że
sense what's
zmienia
going to
się,
happen.
że zmienia
He
się
could
historia.
sense that history is changing.
Gdybym powiedział to na głos,
If I said
opowiedzieliby mi
this aloud,
powszechnym śmiechem.
they would all
Być może
laugh.
za 5 lat,
Maybe in
a na
5
pewno za
years, but
50
certainly in
wszyscy
50
będą o
years,
tym wiedzieć,
everyone will
że
know
założyłem
about it,
państwo.
that I have established a
A tak to
state.
właśnie było.
Because that's actually what happened.
Jego cytat najsłynniejszy w Izraelu jest
His most
Im chafacim atem,
famous
ein zo
quote,
agada.
very well
Jeśli
known
zechcecie,
in
nie
Israel.
będzie to bajką, nie będzie to marzeniem,
If you want something,
będzie
if
to
you will it,
realnością.
it is no dream.
Jednocześnie nie udało mu się przekonać większości żydowskiej
But
elity,
he was not able to convince most
zarówno
of the
jak
Jews
przywódców
from the
ortodoksyjnych,
elites,
tak i reformowanych, nie.
neither the Orthodox
Reformowani
nor the
właśnie tworzyli
Reform
swoje
leaders.
nowe idee
The
o tym,
Reform
że
ones were creating their own ideas about
jesteśmy częścią
emancipation that will
społeczeństwa,
become
jesteśmy
part of the
narodem, nie
society, that we are not a nation, we don't need our own state because we are a religion. Because at the beginning, the reform movement until the 20th century had such views. Reform would substitute halacha with ethics, whereas Zionism would replace halacha with the state. So for the reform movement, the Jewish law became ethics, morality, whereas for some other Jews, it became the idea of a nation, of a state. And we see something like that today. In Israel, if you ask a Jew, who are you? He would say, I'm an Israeli. And we have that today. Back then, you didn't have that. So for the reform movement, it changed in the 1930s. That's when the reform movement changed its approach to the Zionist movement. And from then on, it's a Zionist movement that supports the state of Israel. But until those times, they were of the view that we are simply part of the society. We are Germans of the Jewish faith. So, one way or the other, Zionism, step by step, is being accepted. At first, it doesn't focus on Zion. It doesn't say that we need to live in the land of Israel. Maybe the Hovevei Zion talked about that, but Herzl didn't. They were discussing other places such as Uganda and others, but they would simply say we need to have our own state. Like in the United States, you have many cities named New something. And they looked at it similarly. We'll just have a New Jerusalem, and so on, just like you have New York. But as we know, that's not what happened. So in the 1880s, you had the first Aliyah. And in 1904, you have a new wave of migration from East Europe, the second Aliyah, up until the start of the First World War, and it had about 40,000 Jews. They would be establishing new towns. You had Rishon Zion and others. In 1909, you have the first Hebrew town, Tel Aviv. Jaffa existed before, the great port in Jaffa, where everyone would disembark there, the oranges from the port. But Tel Aviv was established in 1909. So Tel Aviv was a completely new town. Then you had the infrastructure being created thanks to various factors. One of them was the great sacrifice of Theodor Herzl, thanks to his charisma, thanks to the fact that he dedicated his whole life, even the life of his family, to this idea. So he played an essential role. In 1917, so 13 years after his death, the British Secretary of Foreign Matters, Lord Balfour, officially said that the British government supports the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. That was November 1917.
Rok. Więc jeżeli mówimy o znaczeniu, które Theodor Herzl zrobił dla stworzenia państwa żydowskiego, to może być postrzegany
if we discuss the role of Theodor Herzl in establishing the State of Israel, we can say that his impact can be described in three ways. First of all, the description of Judaism as a nationality, not just a religion. And this also led to the development of secular Judaism. I can be a secular Jew now because this is my nationality. The second element was disseminating the idea in his times that integration is useless. It doesn't help with anything. That we simply see that it doesn't work. We've been trying really hard for decades, but since we are actually a nation, then we cannot integrate. So Herzl started the process of the establishment of a true state, the Jewish state. Not the state of a Messiah, but a state that would be established by people. A process that would come to its conclusion in 1948. So Theodor Herzl is widely viewed as the founding father of the Jewish state. The Israeli National Cemetery is next to the mountain of Herzl, the Herzl Mountain. Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, we have a city, Herzliya, we have streets named after him in almost every town. And this is the best well-known image of him when he's leaning on a railing in Basel during the first Zionist Congress, imagining something. So these ideas are both very old and very contemporary, because what's 150 years? But we are discussing something that has influenced today's events. We are talking about something that is influencing the situation that we have now, a situation that is also related to various questions, various problems. As we know that the establishment of the state did not happen peacefully without a struggle, just as it never happened in any part of the world. We always know that the issue of establishing a state is always a difficult one. We always know that there is a high price to pay for it. But based on the examples we discussed today, we see that every person is their own individual and that they have a sense of belonging. and that every person throughout their life will have this feeling that they are a separate, different individual, but there is this important sense of belonging, that you are somewhere, that you are defended. And before, Jews never had that feeling. They were never defended. There was a flourishing culture. There was development. It was great, but wherever they went, there was no one who would defend them. Every authority would say, well, you have some problems. Well, that's your problem. And now, in the 20th century, a place was created, one place where the Jews can say that they have their own state. Living here is not easy. It's not for everyone, but there is a state along with its mistakes, but every state can have their own mistakes. We have our own army, we have our own calendar, we have our own education system, universities, and we'll continue discussing this about during subsequent lectures about the establishment of the state, about our own language. When it comes to Herzl, he did not focus on language or culture. I guess he said, well, I've already taken too much upon myself. I'll be focusing on establishing the state. So he wouldn't even touch the issue of a language, because he knew that if you'd start the discussion about what language should be used in a new state, then it would be a very controversial topic. So we'll keep on discussing these topics. And now let's end for today. Thank you very much for your attention.